The Yamaha Bolt, also known as the Star Bolt, has been around for almost a decade now. You have the original base model, the R-Spec, and the C-Spec. However, the C-Spec, which is what we have today, has only been in production from 2014 to 2017. Technically, the only remaining Bolt model that is still in production is the R-Spec. For whatever reason, they don't even offer the original base model anymore, at least from my understanding. The C-Spec was replaced in 2017 with the SCR 950. All that this bike is at the end of the day is a Bolt with a more scrambler style. It's the exact same bike. Could have just been called the Bolt S-Spec. Why they didn't is kind of beyond me. Sadly, however, is that the SCR 950 went out of production in 2021. I would imagine because they didn't exactly sell well, but then I have never once seen any advertisements or promotions for either the C-Spec or what I now call the S-Spec. So the plan for this video is to review my own 2015 C-Spec Bolt. Fair warning though, if you are looking for a review that goes into intense detail with specs and numbers, that is not this video. I don't prioritize specs. In fact, it's very low on my list of things I personally care about. I care about whether or not the bike is enjoyable to ride and whether or not it puts a smile on my face. I've been on 200s, even 350cc motorcycles with low horsepower that I've enjoyed far more than bikes with engines 3 times its size and technically better on paper stats. I will touch on specs a little, but not ad nauseum. Anyway, first let's talk about the appearance of the C-Spec Bolt. In my favorite color, green. The C-Spec comes in a silver option as well if that's more up your alley. It has graphics on the side of the tank that I really like, especially the line of that brassy gold color really looks great paired with the black and green. Overall, I am a fan of the styling of this bike. The whole cafe aspect to it is not overdone. In fact, it's very modest. Although, one very strange choice is that this bike has the typical styled mirrors. With it being cafe, you'd figure it would have bar end mirrors, or at least ones that mount upside down from the typical location. Another off-the-wall choice, and something I actually strongly dislike about the appearance of this motorcycle, and really most of the Bolts, is the overabundance of this bare metal-colored sections that are sprinkled all throughout the bike. Now, maybe it's just me, I just think it looks incredibly cheap. Had those areas been painted black, chrome, or maybe even that goldish copper color like what's on the graphic of the tank, it would have, in my opinion, vastly improved the appearance of the bike. It's worth noting that this is not the stock exhaust. I swapped it out for a Bassani Megaphone slip-on. The stock one is a heavy, chunky thing, and it's incredibly quiet, while this Bassani is significantly louder and looks much better. One thing I've noticed compared to a lot of other bikes I've owned is that this one, for some reason, gets me the most compliments and the most people turning their heads. Maybe a lot of that attention is because people are confused about the bike. A lot of people think that this is a Harley and then get shocked when I tell them that it's a Yamaha. People who don't know about these bikes or mistake them for something else always ask me about it, which is so interesting to me that this Bolt gets me more attention than any of the other various motorcycles I've been on or have owned combined in the past 7 to 8 years that I've been riding. The Bolt has very basic controls, stuff that you would expect on every bike. It's very bare bones, old school cruiser, and that is all there is to it. It doesn't have auto canceling turn signals, nor would I really care if it did. Regardless, it's all incredibly easy to operate and it's all easily accessible, from the hand controls to the brakes and the shifter, even the side stand. It's all super easy to get to. You really shouldn't have any problems with it. And because I mentioned the speedometer, let's focus on that. It's easily one of the worst things about the bike. Very little information is shown. All you get is a speedometer. There is no tach. Yeah, you have the typical warning and indicator lights, that sort of thing, but that is really all you get on this tiny display. There's no gas gauge. There's nothing that says how many miles you have left until you have to fill up. It does not tell you what your mile per gallon is. No gear indicator. There's very little going on here. It's minimalistic. But don't get me wrong, that is totally fine. I can live without those things. What is horrible about this entire setup is that the display is not only small, but it's dim and hard to read during the day. If you have the sunlight on top of you or even behind you, that poorly lit LCD display that reminds me of like a Game Boy is much harder to read than it ever should be. What doesn't help is that they put a shiny chrome bezel around the speedometer. Yeah, sunlight blasts right off that thing and into your eyes when you try to look down at your speed when you're riding. It sucks. And whoever designed this entire thing, from the chrome bezel to the actual speedometer itself, needs to get a swift kick to the ball sack. I should also point out that the Bolt does not have a kickstand safety, which I think is kinda odd since my old 88 VMAX had a kickstand safety, and that bike is decades older than this Bolt. The Yamaha Bolt features a 5-speed transmission that utilizes a multi-wet plate clutch. Its transmission is not the best in the world, but it's definitely far above average. When you shift, it's very snappy. Like, you always know when you're flipping through the gears due to how the bike reacts and feels. A complaint I often hear about the Bolts is from those who dislike the loud clunk noise that happens as you shift from neutral or while you're shifting throughout the lower gears. I don't get this complaint at all, since a lot of other bikes produce some sort of sound as you're shifting. Some bikes I've been on before sound like someone is throwing a hammer at the hood of a car. I mean, the Bolt isn't even that dramatic. So again, the complaint doesn't make any sense to me. The clutch is easy to operate, the lever has a good amount of pull to it. The engagement point is very easy to understand, both from a seasoned rider to an absolute beginner. My fiance, who has very little experience with motorcycles, figured out the engagement point on the Bolt in a matter of 5 minutes, if that. What I love about the transmission in particular is that you have plenty of power in between the gears. I can be going 40 miles an hour in second gear, and it's not like my bike is screaming bloody murder compared to other bikes, in particular certain Harleys, that do sound like it. Even in fourth gear, going, 50 miles an hour, it coasts. It's not loud at all, yet at the same time, there's plenty of power left before I even need to shift into fifth gear. And that I love. The Yamaha Bolt is powered by an air-cooled 942cc V-twin engine that puts out around 50 horses with 59 foot-pounds of torque. Now, the reason I said around 50 horsepower is because, for some bizarre reason, there's conflicting information online. One source will say 48 horsepower, while another will say 52, or even 54. I don't know what the deal is with that. Regardless, I'm just going to say approximately 50 horses. And it doesn't seem like a lot for this bike, but it's not exactly slow, not by any means. This is a bike that puts out most of its energy and power with the torque and the acceleration than it does with having a high top speed. It only goes to around 105 miles per hour stock, which is barely higher than my Kawasaki Versys 300 that gets to the upper 90s with its top speed. Its 0 to 60, on the other hand, is roughly 4.8 seconds, which really isn't that bad at all for a cruiser like this. It is a torquey bike, that is for damn sure, especially in the lower gears. I mean, it's very responsive, both in terms of its handling, how you manipulate the clutch, as well as the throttle in particular. If you're one of those who has a twitchy throttle hand, you may have a little trouble adjusting to the Bolt, but if you have good throttle control, it shouldn't be a problem whatsoever. Now, that being said, despite the throttle being touchy, it's not super overwhelming. Like, you're not going to accidentally give yourself whiplash or do a backflip. God forbid you gave it a little more gas than you intended. I love the way the bike rides. It does exactly what I want a motorcycle to do as far as its performance goes. I feel as if the bike is an extension of myself when I'm riding it. Like, it's not a bike that is overwhelming or intimidating to be on, which is why I think the Bolt has the reputation it has of being a great choice for both beginners and seasoned riders. I've been riding for almost a decade now, and the Bolt is on the top of my list of bikes that are the most well-rounded and most comfortable rides I've ever been on. Now, these bikes do have various different seating options depending on what model you get. This one came with the bike. It's one of the more comfortable options out there. There's plenty of cushion here to where I am not sore after hours of riding. I have sat on a Bolt in the past that had the solo seat, which I hated violently for two reasons. One being that it's just not comfortable for me, and the other is the way it was designed. Like, there's this giant gap between the tank and the seat itself, which makes me wonder, man, if I ever were to have to hit on my brakes in a hurry, I'm gonna slam my ball sack right up against the tank here, and I'm not really down for that. The seating position is like a weird cross between a traditional cruiser and a sport bike. You lean in a little, but it still gives you that more upright seating position, which is great. The foot controls are slightly oddly placed, not necessarily when you're riding, but more when you're coming to a stop. I almost never know where to put my feet when I'm coming to that stop or while I'm standing, because I'm usually whacking my feet on the pegs. It's almost as if the pegs are too long, or the foot controls themselves should really be placed, I don't know, maybe 2 inches forward or something. What isn't comfortable, and is honestly a bit stupid in design, is the placement of the stock airbox. So this thing just bumps out from the side of the bike and presses directly against your knee. After like 30 minutes, it becomes noticeable and uncomfortable. Yeah, obviously they make plenty of aftermarket air intakes, but then you need to get yourself a power commander or even an ECU reflash, and that ends up being like a $500 to $1,000 plus job, depending on what options you go with. The gas tank holds just over 3 gallons. It's reported to get around 50 miles per gallon, but realistically, expect to go around 120, maybe 130 miles before that gas light pops on, which kinda sucks. It's not like it's a huge negative unless you travel long distances a lot, or maybe even with other riders who may or may not get better gas mileage or have bigger tanks than you do. I've been told that the light pops on when you have maybe 30 to 50 miles before the tank runs dry and you're left stranded. The brakes, on the other hand, are very nice and responsive. They're not spongy at all, and even barely touching on the brakes will get me to a stop relatively easily. It does help that the bike has somewhat of a strong engine brake, which I personally kind of like, but not everyone is fond of that sort of thing. Disappointing is the lack of any ABS option, even on their brand new models. It doesn't come with the bike, and it's not an option. There's no sort of add-ons for it. Unless you live in other countries outside of America, which, yes, the Bolts do have an ABS option out there. Now, why would you not introduce it to the US market? That seems like a no-brainer to me. The Bolt handles really nice. It corners well, it handles low-speed turns very easily. It is a little top-heavy, but not to the point to where it's like cumbersome or awkward to maneuver. The suspension isn't phenomenal by any means. If you live in the Midwest like I do, traveling on shit roads like this is unpleasant to say the least. But normal flat roads, the suspension handles totally fine. You may decide to upgrade with something better down the line, but for what comes with the bike, it's more than doable. There are complaints about front-end wobble at high speeds or being somewhat unstable at high speeds. Now that I can 100% agree with. The bike, stock, if you let go of the handlebars, it'll wobble, which people have figured out that it is because of the pattern on the stock tires and or the steering head bearing needs to be upgraded, which actually isn't that expensive of a fix, so it's not a major deal. If I'm going 50 to maybe 85 miles an hour, I don't really notice it, but anything faster than 85 miles an hour, yeah, it wiggles a little, which of course makes me a bit nervous, but if I were to change out the tires and bearings, then that will go away. But then again, I don't really go past, say, like 90 anymore, don't really have a reason to, and besides, people by me drive like absolute dog shit. So I'm pretty much forced to ride defensively, because people pull out in front of you and stare at you dead in the eye as they're doing it. They just don't care. So it's better for me personally to play it safe than sorry. While going at the typical speeds, the bike definitely feels stable and planted to the pavement. I don't ever feel like the bike wants to throw me off or do anything that is outside of my own control. I feel entirely confident with the bike in terms of its handling and its responses to my movements. Now, as far as the Bolt's reliability, so if I were to base it off of my own personal experiences of owning the bike, I haven't had any issues outside of the battery dying on me and the whole battery swap thing being a little bit more annoying than it needs to be. But outside of that, I haven't had any issues to note outside of adjusting the clutch cables slightly, but who cares? It's not even a big deal. But keep this in mind. My bike is pretty much new. It only has a few thousand miles on it. Due to my disease, I wasn't able to ride for about 9 months because I was recovering from multiple surgeries, and even now, I have a hard time riding for more than 45 minutes at a time because of the extensive nerve damage to my foot. But nonetheless, I do have one complaint in particular in regards to the metal that is used on the bike. It rusts easily, which is weird to me because I have never rode this thing in the rain. It has always been stored or covered, and yet there are still a few areas that I see rust forming, like the front fender and parts of the exhaust header's bolt. Now, both of these areas I do plan on changing out anyway, but still the fact that rust is even forming is a complete mystery to me. So if you ride in the winter with shitty, salty roads or just crappier weather that's rainy, just be aware the Bolt might not be a great idea unless you're one of those who washes your bike religiously all the time. Now, despite that, I've not really heard too much negatives about these bikes in terms of reliability. I do know another guy who has a Bolt with 20,000+ miles on it, and the only things that were done to the bike were basic maintenances like oil filter changes, air filter changes, brakes, and I believe the belt was replaced at around 15,000 miles. So, at the end of the day, despite me hating a few things about the Bolt, I love this bike. Yeah, the speedometer is god-awful, and yeah, the stock airbox is pretty crap, but those things can be addressed. The Bolt's aftermarket community is pretty widespread. There's a lot of stuff out there for these bikes. Now, believe it or not, when I purchased this bike, it only had 20 miles on it, and I purchased it from a dealer back in 2018, I believe, for $3,800. It went so low because they couldn't sell it. No one knew what the bike was, which is great for me because these bikes go for almost double that price nowadays, especially with the low miles that this bike has. I love this thing. It's one of those where every single time I go out for a ride, I don't care if it's even for just 10 minutes, it always puts a smile on my face. And that to me is one of the most important things overall. I want a bike that makes me happy, and the C-Spec does exactly that. With that said, everyone, that just about wraps up this video. I do plan on making another bike review, but this time on my Versys 300, which is obviously a completely different motorcycle entirely compared to the Bolt. Regardless, thank you so much for watching. Please remember to like the video and share it. Obviously, that stuff helps me out with YouTube's kind of crap algorithm, which seems to not really like smaller channels like myself. Either way, guys, thank you so much for watching, and take care.